Hi guys, and welcome to Relaxation Bedtime History. Tonight we wander into the stone heart of Victorian Edinburgh, where the streets look respectable from above but hide an older world below your feet. You stand on a narrow street in the Old Town as evening settles slowly over the city. The sky is turning that soft Scottish blue that arrives just before night, and the lamps along the cobbled road begin to flicker into life one by one. Cold air slides down from the hills. Somewhere a church bell rings the hour slow and patient. From where you stand, Edinburgh looks dignified. Tall tenement houses rise like cliffs on both sides of the street. Their windows glow with candlelight. Carriages rattle past. Gentlemen in dark coats hurry home. Ladies lift their skirts slightly to avoid the mud. It all seems very proper, but the street beneath your boots is not the whole story. You glance down a narrow gap between buildings. It looks less like a street and more like a shadow. A steep passage drops sharply downhill between tall walls of stone. Locals call these passages closes, and there are dozens of them threading through the old town like secret arteries. Tonight you are heading into one of them. You take the first cautious steps downward. The noise of the main street fades surprisingly quickly behind you. Edinburgh has a habit of swallowing sound as soon as you step off its main roads. Your boots scrape over worn stone steps polished by centuries of feet. The walls press close on either side. Windows lean above you at strange angles, their frames warped by time. A faint smell drifts through the air. Coal smoke, damp stone, something sour that has lingered longer than anyone would prefer. You breathe carefully and keep walking. Edinburgh in 1850 is a city layered upon itself. A well-known historical reality is that the old town grew upward rather than outward for centuries. Space inside the city walls was limited, so houses climbed higher and higher. 10 stories was not unusual. People of every social class once lived stacked together in these tall buildings, from merchants near the ground floors to poorer tenants higher up. Yet the story did not stop there. As new bridges and streets were built in later centuries, some older areas were simply built over. The ground level of yesterday became the basement of today. Entire rooms, passageways and courtyards ended up buried beneath the new city, which means that beneath the polished boots walking along the Royal Mile tonight, another world still exists. You continue down the close, the steps growing steeper now. The walls trap the evening chill so that the air feels colder with every turn. A lantern hangs from a crooked bracket halfway down the passage, its light wavering in the breeze. It illuminates a doorway half hidden in shadow. You pause there for a moment. Inside that doorway lies the beginning of the underground city. You might reasonably ask yourself why anyone would choose to live down there. It is a fair question. The air is poor, sunlight barely reaches the lower chambers, and the dampness settles into your bones. Still, people do live there, thousands of them. Industrial growth has drawn workers into Edinburgh faster than the city can comfortably house them. Cheap lodging becomes valuable no matter how cramped or unhealthy it might be. Rooms beneath the streets, forgotten vaults and sealed courtyards suddenly become living spaces once more. Rent is low, the location is close to work. Sometimes that is enough. You push open the door and step inside. A narrow stone corridor stretches ahead. The ceiling arches above you in a heavy curve of brick and mortar. The lantern light from the close barely reaches this far. Instead, a few dim candles burn inside wall niches. The air grows thicker immediately. You can hear people now, quiet voices. A cough somewhere deeper in the corridor. The faint scrape of a chair on stone. Your footsteps echo softly as you move forward. A curious historical note, sometimes mentioned by local historians, is that many of these underground vaults were originally built as storage spaces in the 18th century. Merchants stored goods here, taverns used them as cellars, workshops sometimes operated in the larger chambers. But when business moved elsewhere, the spaces did not simply disappear. They waited. Eventually, the poorest residents of the city found them again. You reach the end of the corridor, where it opens into a low chamber. The ceiling is so low you instinctively duck, though it still sits comfortably above your head. A small fire burns in an iron grate near one wall. Its smoke creeps lazily toward a narrow vent in the ceiling. The firelight flickers across rough stone blocks darkened by soot. A family occupies the room. A woman sits on a stool, mending clothing by candlelight. 2 children share a thin blanket on a straw mattress. A man in a heavy wool coat leans against the wall, with his eyes half closed, the exhaustion of long labour still clinging to him. No one seems surprised by your presence. Visitors come through these spaces occasionally. Curiosity travels easily in cities like this. You nod politely and move on. Your hand brushes the wall as you pass through another archway. The stone feels damp and cold beneath your fingers. Water beads slowly between the mortar lines. The deeper you go, the more the sounds of the city above begin to fade. Carriages, bells, street vendors, all of it becomes muffled by the layers of earth and stone overhead. Instead, you hear the quieter rhythm of underground life. A kettle simmering, low conversation, someone humming an old tune while working by lamplight. It is strangely peaceful for a moment. Then someone coughs again, a harsh cough that echoes through the vaulted corridor. Illness travels easily in crowded places like this. A commonly accepted fact among historians is that 19th century cities struggled constantly with sanitation and disease. Tuberculosis, typhus and cholera were frequent visitors in dense urban neighbourhoods. Underground housing made these problems even worse because ventilation was poor and moisture never fully disappeared. Still, survival has a way of adapting. You pass another chamber where a cobbler works beside a lantern hammer, tapping gently against leather soles. He barely glances up. Work must continue even after the sun sets. And here is an odd little detail you might not expect. Some accounts from the period mention that certain underground rooms occasionally doubled as informal taverns. A barrel of cheap gin or ale would appear, and labourers finishing their shifts could gather in the dim vaults for a drink and conversation away from watchful landlords. It sounds cosy until you remember the air down here. You pause at the base of a stone stairwell leading even deeper. Some parts of this underground network extend surprisingly far beneath the streets. Archaeologists and historians still debate the full extent of the buried chambers because records from the early construction periods are incomplete. Some suggest entire alleyways once existed where only sealed walls remain today. In other words, even the people studying this place are not entirely sure where it ends. You look down the stairwell. Darkness gathers there like a thick curtain. Above your head, faint footsteps cross the street far above. The respectable city continues its evening routine. Dinner tables are set. Candles glow in upper windows. Gentlemen discuss politics and trade while warming themselves beside comfortable fireplaces. And directly beneath them, another Edinburgh carries on quietly under stone. You take a slow breath. Then you begin descending the next set of steps deeper into the underground city that most polite society prefers not to think about. The stairwell turns sharply and carries you deeper beneath the city. The air grows cooler with every step, though not exactly fresh. It has the heavy stillness of a place where wind rarely travels and sunlight almost never arrives. You run a hand along the wall as you descend. The stone feels rough and damp beneath your fingers, worn smooth in places by generations of passing hands. Someone long ago carved small grooves along the edge of the steps to keep from slipping. In a place like this, small practical details matter. A lantern burns near the bottom of the stairs. Its glass is clouded with soot and the flame inside trembles slightly whenever someone moves nearby. You reach the last step and pause. The corridor ahead is narrower than the one above, and the ceiling dips lower so that even someone of average height must be careful not to brush the stone. A faint yellow glow spills from doorways along the passage. Voices drift through the air, quiet talk, the occasional laugh. It surprises you a little. You might have expected silence or misery. Instead, the underground chambers feel almost like a strange neighbourhood hidden beneath the city streets. You begin walking. The floor is uneven stone, damp in places where water seeps slowly through the walls. Every few yards, a small alcove holds a candle or lantern. Their light forms little islands of warmth in the otherwise shadowy passage. From somewhere farther down the corridor comes the sound of boots scraping across stone. A man appears around the bend carrying a sack over his shoulder. He nods politely as he passes, the gesture brief but friendly enough. His clothes smell faintly of coal dust. Many residents here work above ground during the day. Porters, dock, labourers, factory hands, street sellers. When the workday ends, they return to these underground rooms which serve as their homes because rent above the street is simply too expensive. A well-accepted historical fact is that Edinburgh's Old Town was among the most densely populated urban areas in Europe during parts of the 19th century. Thousands of people lived packed into tall tenements and narrow closes. When space ran out, unused vaults beneath bridges and streets became unofficial housing. Not comfortable housing, but housing all the same. You continue along the corridor and notice something else about the underground world. Sound travels differently here. A whisper seems to carry farther than expected, while footsteps fade strangely fast. Ahead, a doorway stands open. Inside the chamber, you glimpse 3 women gathered around a small wooden table. One is slicing bread with careful motions, while another stirs something slowly in a pot hanging over a modest fire. The third woman rocks a baby in her arms, humming softly. The room is cramped but orderly, blankets folded neatly, a few tin cups arranged beside the wall. They glance toward you briefly, curious but not alarmed. Visitors sometimes wander down here, students from the university, writers seeking inspiration, even the occasional city official who wishes to observe conditions firsthand. You nod politely again and keep walking. The corridor bends slightly, revealing a set of shallow steps climbing back upward toward another close. Cold air drifts faintly down from the opening above, bringing with it the distant noise of carriage wheels and late evening chatter. That small breath of outside air feels almost refreshing. Yet the residents below seem accustomed to the atmosphere. Life adapts quickly when there is no other choice. A curious little anecdote sometimes mentioned in local accounts tells of musicians who occasionally played fiddles in these underground vaults during winter evenings. The curved ceilings of the chambers created a strange echo that amplified the music. Some listeners claimed the sound was surprisingly beautiful, like a concert hall carved out of stone. You imagine a violin note floating through these dark corridors. Perhaps not every night down here is as bleak as outsiders assume. Still, the environment is undeniably harsh. The dampness clings to everything. Bedding never fully dries. Fires struggle to burn cleanly because ventilation is poor. And then there is the question of light. You glance upward instinctively, though of course there is no sky to see. Many underground rooms receive only the faintest suggestion of daylight through narrow vents or stairwells. Residents rely on candles, lanterns and small fires for illumination. These sources fill the air with soot and smoke. Your eyes adjust slowly as you walk farther from the lantern at the stairwell. Somewhere ahead a child laughs suddenly. You turn a corner and find two boys rolling a wooden hoop along the corridor floor with sticks. Their game echoes cheerfully between the stone walls. They freeze when they notice you watching. One of them grins. Then the hoop clatters forward again and they disappear around another bend, laughter trailing behind them. Childhood does not pause simply because the ceiling is low and the air is stale. You continue onward, following the faint light of another chamber. This one appears to serve as a shared cooking space. A large iron pot hangs above a central fire, while several people move around it with quiet efficiency. Someone pours water from a battered kettle. Someone else arranges small bowls along a narrow shelf. The smell of broth fills the room. It is thin broth, judging by the aroma. Perhaps cabbage. Maybe a little barley, if fortune has been kind that week. Simple food keeps people going through long days of labour. Another voice speaks from the corner, low and thoughtful. The conversation drifts towards city news, a landlord raising rents again, a rumour about new building works near the North Bridge. These discussions matter greatly down here, because the shape of the city above often determines what happens below. Historians still argue whether the authorities of 19th century Edinburgh fully understood the scale of underground habitation beneath the Old Town. Some evidence suggests officials were aware but struggled to enforce housing regulations in spaces that technically were never designed as homes. In other words, the underground city existed in a strange legal grey area. You leave the cooking room behind and continue walking. The corridor widens slightly before narrowing again. Stone arches repeat one after another like ribs inside the body of some ancient creature. Candlelight dances along the curved ceilings. Your footsteps slow. The deeper you go, the more you feel the weight of the city pressing above. Layers of stone, streets, houses, entire lives unfolding overhead without ever noticing the quiet world beneath them. And yet here it is. Families sleeping, children playing, workers mending boots or warming their hands by dim fires. Edinburgh has many faces, but few visitors ever see this one. Ahead, another staircase slopes downward into darker vaults still waiting below. You pause for a moment at the top of the steps. Then, with the quiet curiosity of someone exploring a hidden layer of history, you continue deeper. The next stairway feels older than the ones above. The steps are slightly uneven, worn, hollow in the centre, where countless feet have pressed down over the years. As you descend, the light from the upper corridors fades behind you, replaced by a deeper amber glow that flickers farther below. Your boots land softly on the damp stone. The air here carries a heavier scent. Coal smoke lingers along with something earthy like wet soil that never quite dries. A small trickle of water runs down one wall, disappearing into a narrow groove cut into the floor. Someone clearly planned for water to travel somewhere. Whether that plan still works is another matter. You reach the bottom and step into another vaulted passage wider than the corridor above. The ceiling arches overhead in a graceful curve of brick. It almost feels like walking through the belly of a giant cathedral built entirely underground. Except this cathedral contains laundry lines. A row of shirts and stockings hangs across the passage, dripping slowly into a shallow basin placed beneath them. The cloth barely stirs in the still air. A woman nearby wrings out another piece of fabric and glances toward you with mild curiosity. She dips the cloth into a bucket again, squeezes it carefully, then hangs it beside the others. Washing clothes down here is not an easy task. Water must be carried down from pumps or wells above ground. Every bucket is work. Yet the effort matters. Clean clothing offers one of the few defences against illness in a place where fresh air is scarce. You continue along the passage, careful not to brush against the damp garments. The corridor bends slightly before opening into a surprisingly large chamber. Several families share this space. A row of narrow bedding pallets lines one wall. Straw mattresses covered with blankets, patched many times over. Small wooden chests sit beside them, holding whatever possessions the residents own. At the far end of the chamber, a group of men sit around a rough table playing cards by lantern light. Their voices remain low, though occasional laughter ripples through the room like a warm breeze. The atmosphere is oddly calm. You might expect despair here, but daily life often softens even the harshest environments. People form routines, they find small comforts. A well-documented historical detail reveals that Edinburgh's Old Town tenements once held people from nearly every social class stacked vertically in the same buildings. Merchants and professionals sometimes occupied lower floors, while labourers and poorer tenants lived higher up where the climb was steep and water harder to carry. But when the city began modernising in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, wealthier residents moved toward the newer districts. The grand Georgian streets of the new town drew them away. The old town was left behind. As conditions worsened above ground, the poorest residents were pushed further downward into the unused vaults and buried chambers. Which brings you here tonight. A young girl crosses the chamber carrying a tin cup of water. She moves carefully, stepping between scattered shoes and baskets without spilling a drop. Her hair is tied back with a faded ribbon. When she notices you watching, she offers a small polite nod before disappearing through another archway. Even in a place like this, manners still survive. Near the fire at the centre of the chamber, an older man sits repairing a pair of boots. His fingers move with slow precision as he threads a needle through thick leather. The lantern beside him casts a warm halo of light around his hands. The tapping sound of his hammer echoes softly across the stone. A small curious detail recorded in some 19th century reports describes how certain underground rooms served as informal workshops during the evenings. Cobblers, tailors and basket makers often continued their trades after returning from daytime labour. The underground spaces offered cheap workrooms when rented shops above ground were too costly. You watch the cobbler for a moment longer before moving on. Another corridor branches off from the chamber. This one feels narrower and darker. The lantern light behind you fades quickly as you step forward. Soon, the only illumination comes from a single candle placed inside a niche in the wall. Its flame bends slightly when you pass. A low murmur of voices drifts toward you from deeper within the passage. You follow the sound until the corridor opens into a smaller room, where three men sit close together speaking quietly. A small barrel rests beside them along with several chipped mugs. Gin. The sharp scent gives it away immediately. Cheap spirits circulate through the underground community just as they do in taverns above the streets. After long days of physical labour, a drink offers warmth and temporary escape. Of course, it also carries its own problems. But tonight the men simply talk. One gestures animatedly while telling a story that causes the others to shake their heads and smile. You move past without interrupting. The corridor curves again, leading toward another archway sealed by a thick wooden door. The door stands partly open, revealing only darkness beyond. You hesitate. Not every chamber underground remains occupied. Some have been abandoned for years. Others collapsed or sealed after structural damage. The underground city shifts slowly over time, its passages altered by repairs, neglect and the gradual settling of stone. Scholars still debate the full size of Edinburgh's buried vault network, because many areas remain inaccessible or forgotten. Maps from different centuries show changing layouts, sealed doorways, and entire sections that appear or vanish between records. In other words, parts of the underground city may still be waiting to be rediscovered. You gently push the wooden door open. The chamber beyond is empty. Dust coats the floor in a thin grey layer. A broken crate sits in one corner beside a rusted iron hook embedded in the ceiling. The air feels colder here, undisturbed. You take a few careful steps inside. Your footsteps stir faint echoes that bounce between the walls. Somewhere above you hear the dull rumble of a carriage crossing the street far overhead. The sound arrives muffled and distant as though travelling through layers of time. For a moment you imagine the generations who have walked these corridors before you. Merchants storing barrels of grain, workers hauling crates, families settling into dark rooms with what little furniture they could afford. And now you, exploring the quiet spaces between those lives. You turn back towards the corridor. Outside, the candle flame still flickers patiently in its niche, guiding the way through the underground maze. Farther along the passage, another chamber glows faintly with firelight. Life continues there, just as it does in every corner of this hidden city beneath Edinburgh. You follow the light. The candle behind you fades into the distance as you follow the glow of firelight deeper through the underground corridor. The passage widens slowly, and after several quiet steps, you arrive beneath another broad stone arch. This vault feels older than the rooms you passed earlier. The bricks above your head are darker, some chipped along the edges, their mortar slightly crumbling after decades of damp air. Your footsteps echo in the chamber with a soft, hollow rhythm. Someone has built a small cooking fire against the wall, the flames licking gently around a ring of blackened stones. A kettle rests on top its lid, rattling faintly as steam escapes in little bursts. Two men sit beside it, sharing a quiet conversation. One rubs his hands together toward the warmth. The other leans back against a crate, his hat pulled low over tired eyes. They glance up as you enter, offering the brief nod that seems to serve as greeting down here. You nod back and move along. The farther you walk, the clearer it becomes that these underground spaces were never originally intended for families or long-term living. The vaults stretch in orderly rows, their ceilings shaped in repeating brick curves that suggest careful planning. City records from the 18th century indicate that many of these vaults were constructed beneath the arches of bridges and new streets during a period of expansion. As Edinburgh grew, engineers raised certain roadways to smooth the steep slopes of the Old Town. In doing so, they created hollow chambers beneath the stone arches supporting those roads. At first, the spaces proved quite useful. Merchants stored barrels of wine grain and imported goods here. Some rooms functioned as workshops. Others became tavern cellars where casks of ale rested in the cool darkness. But as decades passed and trade patterns shifted, some of the vaults lost their original purpose. Unused space rarely stays empty for long in a crowded city. You move toward a side corridor where a faint blue light trickles down from above. A narrow vent shaft climbs upward between the stones, barely wide enough for daylight to squeeze through. The beam of light cuts through the dusty air like a pale ribbon. You pause beneath it. For a moment, you can almost imagine the sky above, perhaps a cloud drifting over the rooftops, perhaps the last colours of evening fading behind the castle on its rocky hill. Then the sound of footsteps breaks the thought. A young man descends the stairway at the end of the corridor, carrying a sack of coal across his shoulder. His boots leave faint black smudges along the stone floor as he passes. Coal is life in 19th century Edinburgh. It heats homes, powers factories, fuels kitchen fires. The city consumes it constantly. One curious observation from visitors in the 1840s describes how the smell of coal smoke hung over the old town like a permanent fog during colder months. Even underground chambers absorb the scent, so that clothing, blankets and hair all carry the same smoky trace. You can smell it now as the young man disappears into another room. The corridor ahead slopes slightly upward. As you follow it, the air becomes just a little lighter, stirred by faint currents drifting down from the street above. Soon you arrive at a stone stairwell leading back toward the surface. You climb halfway and stop. From this position, you can see a slice of the close outside. The sky above has turned darker now. Lanterns burn along the narrow passage, casting long shadows against the high walls of tenement houses. Voices echo faintly from the street. Someone laughs. A cart rattles past the entrance of the close, its wheels clattering across cobbles. Then the sounds fade again as you step back down into the underground corridor. It feels like slipping between two different worlds. Above ground, Edinburgh carries on with its evening routines. Shopkeepers close their shutters. Families gather around supper tables. Students hurry between lectures and lodgings. Below ground, life moves at a quieter pace. You walk farther along the corridor and notice that the stone floor becomes slightly smoother here. Someone has swept the area recently. A wooden bench sits against the wall beside a stack of small crates. From one of the nearby chambers comes the soft rhythm of a spinning wheel. You peer inside. A woman sits beside a lantern, turning the wheel steadily while loose wool passes through her fingers. The thread forms slowly, twisting into a thin cord that gathers onto a spindle beside her knee. She works patiently, barely looking up as you watch. An unexpected detail preserved in a few 19th century reports suggests that spinning and small textile work sometimes continued inside these vaults during the evenings. For families trying to stretch limited income, every hour of work mattered. The spinning wheel hums quietly. Thread after thread winds into place. You leave the doorway gently so as not to interrupt her rhythm. The corridor continues deeper beneath the city, branching into several smaller passages. Some lead toward occupied chambers where candlelight flickers warmly. Others fade into darker stretches where unused rooms sit sealed behind wooden doors. The underground city feels less like a single space and more like a maze slowly carved by human necessity. One passage draws your attention because of the faint draft flowing through it. The air moves slightly faster here, carrying distant sounds from somewhere above. You follow the current until you reach a broad arch opening into another chamber. This one feels different. The ceiling rises higher and several lanterns hang from iron hooks along the walls. A handful of residents sit together on benches, while a man near the centre reads aloud from a folded newspaper. The listeners lean in close. News travels slowly through the poorer districts of the city. Newspapers cost money, and many residents rely on shared copies or public readings like this to hear about events beyond their immediate streets. The reader clears his throat and continues. He mentions shipping arrivals at Leith Harbour, a political debate in Parliament, rising food prices. Each sentence floats gently across the vaulted chamber. Some listeners nod thoughtfully, others simply listen in silence. A few historians suggest that gatherings like these form small pockets of community within crowded urban districts. Even underground people sought ways to remain connected to the wider world. You linger for a moment, listening to the calm, steady voice, echoing against the brick ceiling. Then you slip quietly back into the corridor. The night above Edinburgh continues deepening, though down here time feels almost suspended. The lanterns burn with the same steady glow. Conversations drift through the stone halls. Fires crackle softly. And somewhere farther ahead, another stairway slopes downward into chambers you have not yet explored. You turn towards the darker passage. Curiosity leads you forward once more into the hidden layers of the city beneath your feet. You move into the darker passage, and the warmth of the previous chamber fades behind you. The corridor narrows again, its walls rougher here, less carefully finished. Moisture glistens faintly on the bricks, where lantern light reaches them. Your footsteps sound softer now because the floor has been scattered with old straw to soak up dampness. The air changes as well. A stronger scent drifts toward you. Coal smoke mixes with the sharp bite of cheap gin and the sour smell of long settled moisture. It is not pleasant, but it is unmistakably alive with human activity. You follow the smell around a bend. Soon, a row of small chambers appears along one side of the passage, each doorway half covered by cloth curtains or wooden planks set loosely against the frame. Candlelight flickers through the gaps, revealing glimpses of everyday routines. In one room, a man sits on the floor sorting through a pile of coal pieces. He places the larger chunks into a crate and sweeps the dust aside with slow, careful movements. Coal is valuable even in small fragments. Across the corridor, a woman ladles stew from a pot into 3 mismatched bowls, while 2 children sit patiently on a wooden crate waiting for their share. The steam rises gently into the low ceiling. Simple meals like this appear often in working-class homes of the time. Contemporary observers frequently noted that cabbage barley and bits of salted meat form the backbone of many urban diets in 19th century Scotland. It was not glamorous food, but it kept people moving through long days of labour. You walk a little farther and notice a door standing fully open. Inside, several men sit at a rough table lit by 2 lanterns. A battered bottle stands in the centre beside a handful of tin cups. Their coats hang on nails hammered into the stone wall. They speak quietly, but the tone carries warmth. One man gestures as he tells a story about hauling cargo at the docks earlier that morning. Another interrupts with a laugh, insisting that the tale grows taller with every retelling. The gin bottle passes from hand to hand. An unusual little observation recorded by visitors during the 1840s mentions that underground rooms like these sometimes became informal gathering places after work hours. Labourers who could not afford taverns above ground occasionally pooled a few coins to share drink and conversation in these dim vaults. The practice gave rise to small social circles hidden beneath the city streets. You nod politely as you pass the doorway. One of the men lifts his cup in friendly acknowledgement before returning to the conversation. The corridor bends again and slopes gently downward. You notice that the stone walls here feel colder when you brush them with your fingers. Water seeps slowly between the bricks and forms small puddles along the edge of the floor. A faint metallic clink echoes somewhere ahead. You follow the sound and soon discover its source. A young boy kneels beside a narrow table where several small metal objects lie arranged in careful rows. Buttons, buckles, and scraps of tin glimmer in the lantern light. He taps each piece lightly with a tiny hammer, shaping them into usable forms. His concentration is impressive. Child labour forms a quiet but constant part of industrial life during this era. Reports from the mid-19th century frequently mention young workers assisting family trades or performing small tasks to earn a few extra pennies. In crowded urban districts, every pair of hands contributes something. The boy barely glances up as you walk by. His hammer continues its steady rhythm against the metal. The passage widens again ahead, revealing another chamber where several crates sit stacked near the wall. Their wooden lids carry faint markings from distant shipping ports. You crouch beside one crate and trace the faded letters with your finger. Goods often travel surprising distances before ending up here. Edinburgh maintains strong trade links through the nearby harbour at Leith, and items from across Britain and beyond pass through the city's markets. Occasionally, some of those goods find temporary storage underground. One rather peculiar anecdote from a travel diary of the time describes a merchant who once discovered an entire shipment of imported oranges hidden in an unused vault beneath the Old Town. According to the story, the fruit had been forgotten for weeks and filled the chamber with a strangely sweet fragrance. Unfortunately, such pleasant smells are rare tonight. You stand again and continue forward. The deeper vaults seem quieter than the upper corridors. Fewer voices drift through the air. Instead, you hear small domestic sounds that repeat softly through the stone halls. A kettle lid rattling, fabric rustling as someone shakes out bedding, the distant scrape of a chair being moved. Your lantern casts long shadows as you walk, stretching the arches of the corridor into shapes that ripple along the walls. For a moment you pause beside a narrow ventilation shaft that climbs toward the street above. A thin current of air slips down through the opening, carrying faint outside noises, hooves striking cobblestones, a distant call from a street vendor still selling late goods. Then the sounds fade again as the air settles. Some researchers today continue to examine how these underground spaces were ventilated during their earliest use as storage vaults. There remains discussion about whether the original designers expected any long-term human occupation here, since the airflow systems appear limited. Whatever the original intention, people eventually adapted the space as best they could. You leave the vent behind and enter another chamber lit by a single lantern hanging from an iron hook. A woman sits near the light, repairing a coat with careful stitches. The needle moves steadily through the cloth while a young girl beside her sorts buttons into a small wooden box. Their quiet teamwork fills the room with a calm sense of purpose. Life underground depends heavily on cooperation. Shared fires, shared tools, shared food whenever possible. Without that small network of support, survival in these dim spaces would become far more difficult. You step gently back into the corridor. Farther along the passage, another faint glow waits, marking yet another occupied room in the labyrinth beneath Edinburgh. You follow it slowly, breathing in the smoky air of coal and candle wax as the underground city continues unfolding around you. You follow the faint glow at the end of the corridor, stepping carefully where the stone floor dips and rises. The lantern you carry sways gently with each movement, sending warm light across the curved brick ceiling above. The shadows stretch and fold along the walls like slow-moving waves. The chamber ahead opens wider than the others you have passed tonight. Inside, the air feels warmer. Several lanterns hang from iron hooks, and the room carries the low hum of quiet activity. You pause near the entrance, letting your eyes adjust to the brighter light. Work continues here, even though the night above the city has grown deep. Along one wall, a man sits beside a small bench covered in tools. Leather scraps are scattered around his feet, while a pair of worn boots rests in his lap. His hands move steadily with needle and thread as he repairs the cracked seams. The slow pull of the thread creates a soft, rasping sound that blends with the crackle of a nearby fire. A little farther along, a woman leans over a wooden crate that serves as her work table. Several baskets sit beside her, half filled with bundles of herbs and dried leaves. She ties them into small packets with careful fingers. These packets will likely be sold above ground in the morning. During the 19th century, many urban residents relied on small trades like this to survive. Selling herbs, mending clothing, sharpening knives, carrying goods through the streets. The economy of a crowded city rarely rests, and much of its labour continues quietly after sunset. You walk deeper into the chamber. Near the centre of the room, a narrow workbench stands beneath two lanterns. 3 men sit there carving small pieces of wood into simple handles. A pile of finished shapes grows steadily beside them. Their conversation drifts through the warm air in calm murmurs. One mentions the price of coal rising again. Another complains about the endless climb up the steep closes each morning before work. Despite the long day they have already endured, their hands keep moving. An interesting detail preserved in several old police reports describes how some underground rooms were known to host small evening workshops like this. Authorities occasionally worried that illegal goods might be produced in hidden spaces beneath the city, although many of the activities turned out to be ordinary trades carried out by people who simply lacked proper shops above ground. The men glance up briefly as you pass, offering quiet nods before returning to their work. You continue toward the far side of the chamber, where another corridor branches away into darkness. The passage slopes downward once more, its bricks slightly older and darker than those above. Before entering, you pause beside the fire at the centre of the room. The flames glow gently inside a low iron grate. Their warmth spreads through the chamber, pushing back the chill that seeps constantly from the surrounding stone. A kettle sits above the fire, releasing slow curls of steam that drift toward the ceiling. The smell of tea mingles with the ever-present scent of coal smoke. A man seated nearby pours a small cup and offers it towards you with a polite gesture. The tea is thin and slightly bitter, but it feels comforting in the cool underground air. Moments like this create small islands of warmth within the harsher environment surrounding them. You thank him quietly and move on. The next corridor feels noticeably quieter. The lantern light behind you fades, quickly replaced by a softer glow coming from scattered candles placed along the walls. Each flame sits protected inside a shallow niche carved into the stone. Your footsteps echo faintly again. Ahead the corridor bends sharply before opening into another vaulted chamber. This one appears less busy than the previous room. Only 2 figures occupy the space. A middle-aged man kneels beside a crate filled with tools, while a younger apprentice watches closely. The older man demonstrates how to sharpen a blade against a whetstone, moving the metal carefully across the surface with steady strokes. The scraping sound fills the room with a gentle rhythm. Learning a trade often happens in places exactly like this. Apprenticeship forms the backbone of many skilled professions during the 19th century. Young workers observe practice and gradually earn the right to work independently. You linger near the doorway for a moment as the lesson continues. The apprentice repeats the motion slowly, his brow furrowed with concentration. The older man nods approvingly. Then you continue down the corridor. The underground air grows cooler again as the passage slopes even deeper beneath the streets. Somewhere above you faintly hear the distant rumble of carriage wheels crossing the cobblestones of Edinburgh. It reminds you that another city still lives overhead, yet the underground world maintains its own rhythm. Lanterns glow softly, tools tap against wood and leather. Voices murmur through the curved stone halls. One curious observation mentioned in a travel journal from the mid-19th century describes how visitors sometimes compared the underground vaults to the inside of a giant stone beehive. Each chamber held its own small activity, and narrow corridors connected them in a network that hummed quietly with human life. The comparison feels surprisingly accurate tonight. You pass several closed doors along the corridor now. Their wooden planks are worn smooth by time. Some appear locked, while others stand slightly ajar, revealing dark rooms beyond where no candles burn. These spaces may once have served as storage or sleeping quarters, or they may simply be waiting for future occupants. Modern researchers continue discussing how extensive the underground vault system beneath the Old Town truly is. Some sections remain mapped only through scattered historical descriptions, while others lie sealed behind collapsed walls or forgotten stairways, which means the labyrinth you are walking through might still hide chambers no one has entered for generations. The thought lingers pleasantly in your mind. You continue along the passage until a faint golden glow appears once again ahead. Another chamber waits beyond the next archway, its lantern light spilling gently across the stone floor. From inside comes the low murmur of voices and the steady rhythm of someone hammering softly against metal. Night work continues in the hidden rooms beneath Edinburgh. You step forward toward the glow, ready to see what the next vault reveals. The chamber ahead glows softly with lantern light, and the gentle tapping of metal against metal guides you forward. As you step beneath the archway, the space opens wider than most of the passages you have crossed tonight. The ceiling rises high enough that your breath feels slightly freer, though the air still carries that familiar mixture of coal smoke, candle wax and damp stone. Several children occupy the centre of the room. At first glance, it almost resembles a playground, though a rather unusual one. A wooden hoop rolls along the floor while a boy runs after it with a stick guiding it in careful circles between scattered crates. Two younger girls crouch nearby, arranging small stones into patterns that mean something only to them. Their laughter bounces against the brick ceiling. It feels bright and lively in a place that outsiders might imagine as nothing but gloom. You lean against the wall for a moment, watching quietly. The lantern beside you casts a warm halo over the chamber, illuminating the smooth curves of the vaulted ceiling. These arches repeat across the room like ribs supporting the weight of the city above. Accounts written during the 19th century often mention how many children grew up in Edinburgh's Old Town within extremely crowded housing. Entire families sometimes occupied a single room, and the narrow closes became informal playgrounds where children spent much of their time. In places where outdoor space was scarce, even underground corridors like these could become areas for games. The boy chasing the hoop nearly collides with you before noticing your presence. He stops short, breathing hard from the chase, then grins shyly. The hoop wobbles once and falls to the stone floor. After a quick nod, he scoops it up again and runs off, continuing the game, as if the interruption barely happened. Childhood rarely pauses for long. Near the far wall of the chamber, a group of older children sit around a small lantern placed carefully on the ground. They have drawn shapes in chalk along the floor, creating what looks like a rough board for a game. One girl rolls a pair of small bones like dice. Another claps softly when the result pleases her. The simple joy in their voices spreads through the chamber like a warm current. You begin walking again, stepping carefully between the chalk markings. As you pass the lantern circle, one of the boys glances up at you with quick curiosity before returning to the game. Farther along the chamber, a woman sits on a wooden crate sewing by candlelight. A small pile of patched garments rests beside her knee. From time to time, she lifts her head to check on the children, though her needle never stops moving. Families down here rely heavily on shared supervision. Adults work long hours above ground, and neighbours often keep watch over one another's children when needed. You pause near a narrow stairwell that climbs toward another level of vaults. The faint echo of footsteps drifts down from somewhere above. For a moment, you imagine the layers of life stacked through the stone. Children playing in the chamber beneath the street. Families eating supper in tenement rooms above. Carriages rolling past on cobbled roads under the glow of gas lamps. Edinburgh is a city built vertically as much as horizontally. An unusual note preserved in a visitor's journal from the 1830s describes how travellers sometimes heard children singing underground in the evening hours. The writer claimed the sound floated through the arches in such a strange echo that it resembled a distant choir. Whether that description was a bit exaggerated or not, the acoustics of these vaults certainly give voices an unexpected softness. You hear something similar now. One of the girls begins humming while arranging the chalk pieces on the floor. The tune is simple and repetitive, the kind of melody that settles easily into memory. Her voice drifts gently through the chamber, A younger child soon joins in, attempting to match the notes. Their quiet song spreads through the vaulted room until even the boy chasing the hoop slows down to listen. The moment feels peaceful, yet life underground carries challenges that cannot be ignored. Doctors writing about urban living conditions during this period frequently warned that cramped housing exposed children to illness more easily. Poor ventilation, damp bedding, and limited sunlight created environments where coughs and fevers could spread quickly. Despite those dangers, families adapted as best they could. You notice a small chalkboard leaning against the wall near the sewing woman. A few letters have been written across it in uneven strokes. Perhaps someone here is learning to read. Education in poorer districts often happened informally, sometimes guided by neighbours or charity teachers who visited crowded neighbourhoods during the week. You crouch briefly to examine the chalk marks. The letters form the beginning of a simple word. Home. You smile quietly and stand again. From the far end of the chamber, another corridor stretches away into deeper darkness. Its entrance is marked by 2 lanterns hanging from iron hooks, their flames trembling slightly in a faint draught. Before moving on, you glance once more at the group of children. The hoop rolls again across the floor. The chalk game continues. The humming song fades into soft laughter. Life persists here in the most ordinary ways, even beneath layers of stone and shadow. You step toward the lanterns and enter the next corridor. The passage slopes downward, once more carrying you deeper beneath the streets of Victorian Edinburgh. The sounds of children gradually fade behind you until only the quiet drip of water and the distant murmur of voices remain. Another chamber waits ahead, glowing faintly with firelight, and somewhere within it the underground city continues its long night. You leave the sounds of children behind and follow the corridor where the lanterns sway gently in their hooks. The air feels slightly cooler here. A thin draught slips through the passage, carrying faint traces of outside night air that must have found its way down through cracks and stairwells far above. Your lantern light moves across the bricks as you walk. The ceiling dips a little lower again, and you instinctively bow your head as you pass beneath one of the arches. The walls feel older here. Some bricks have shifted slightly over time, leaving thin seams where moisture gathers. A few more steps bring you into another chamber. This one holds fewer people than the last, but its atmosphere feels busier in a different way. Several wooden barrels sit stacked along one side of the room, and a pair of men are carefully shifting them across the floor using short iron levers. The barrels scrape softly against the stone. You step aside to give them room as they guide one of the heavy containers into place beside the others. When they finish, one wipes his brow and lets out a long breath. Work like this happens quietly during the evening hours. Moving supplies underground during the day would attract too much attention in the crowded close above. Municipal surveys carried out during the Victorian period revealed that the Old Town's buildings housed astonishing numbers of people within very limited space. Entire stairwells could contain dozens of residents spread across multiple floors. When storage space or workrooms were needed, unused vaults beneath the streets became a convenient, if unofficial, solution. The men finish arranging the barrels and exchange a few quiet words before disappearing through a side doorway. You continue across the chamber. Near the far wall stands a narrow table where a lantern illuminates a small stack of papers. A thin man sits there carefully writing with a quill pen. His brow is furrowed with concentration, while the tip of the feather scratches softly against the page. Writing underground seems slightly surprising. You move closer and notice that the pages appear to contain lists, names perhaps, or records of goods passing through the vaults. The man pauses long enough to dip his pen into a small bottle of ink. He glances at you briefly, offering a polite nod before returning to his work. The presence of written records down here reminds you how closely the underground life connects with the city above. Even in hidden spaces, commerce continues to function. A curious remark appears in a mid-19th century travel diary describing how some visitors believed certain merchants secretly used underground vaults to avoid taxes on stored goods. Whether that claim was accurate or simply a colourful rumour is difficult to confirm, but the story circulated widely enough to appear in several accounts of the period. You leave the writing table behind and follow another corridor branching off from the chamber. The passage slopes gently upward this time. The air becomes slightly fresher as you climb, and soon a faint glow of streetlight appears ahead. You reach a narrow opening that leads to a close above ground. For a moment you step halfway into the entrance and peer upward. Tall buildings rise on either side like towering cliffs of stone. Windows glow softly with candlelight. Somewhere higher up, a door closes with a hollow thud. A carriage rolls past the mouth of the close, its wheels clattering over the cobbles before fading into the night. The contrast between the lively streets above and the dim vaults below feels striking. Many visitors during the Victorian era remarked on this unusual arrangement of Edinburgh's Old Town. Elegant drawing rooms and bustling shops might sit only a few floors above areas where severe poverty shaped everyday life. The vertical layering of wealth and hardship created one of the most dramatic social landscapes in Britain. You step back down into the underground corridor. The lantern glow replaces the faint streetlight as you descend once more beneath the arch. Ahead, the passage widens again, leading into a large vaulted hall supported by thick stone pillars. Several fires burn here, filling the room with warm light that dances across the brick ceiling. People gather around the flames in small groups. Some talk quietly while sharing bowls of stew. Others sit silently warming their hands after long hours outside. A man near one pillar carefully sharpens a knife while listening to a conversation unfolding nearby. The atmosphere feels calm and almost communal. You move slowly along the edge of the room. From time to time someone glances up with mild curiosity, but no one seems bothered by your presence. Visitors occasionally wander through these vaults, and the residents appear accustomed to curious eyes. One rather unusual story recorded by a 19th century writer claims that performers sometimes entertained crowds in underground chambers like this. According to the tale, fiddlers and storytellers gathered listeners beneath the arches on winter nights when the wind outside became too bitter for street performances. Whether such events were common or only occasional remains uncertain, but the idea of music echoing through these vaulted halls feels easy to imagine. You stop near one of the pillars and listen. The fire crackles softly. Voices rise and fall in quiet conversation. From somewhere deeper in the chamber comes the rhythmic clink of metal tools striking together. The underground city hums with its own steady life. Yet even here, the divisions of Victorian society remain visible. The residents you see tonight belong mostly to the working class. Porters, labourers, small tradespeople. Those with greater wealth rarely descend into spaces like these unless curiosity leads them briefly downward. Researchers continue discussing how much the more comfortable residents of Edinburgh truly knew about the conditions beneath their feet. Some evidence suggests awareness existed but was often ignored, while other accounts implied genuine surprise when reformers later exposed the extent of overcrowding in the Old Town. Either way, the underground world carried on quietly for years. You cross the hall and enter another corridor beyond the pillars. This one curves, gently disappearing into shadow, where only a single lantern glows at the far end. Your footsteps echo softly as you approach it. Behind you, the voices and firelight fade once again into the stone labyrinth beneath Edinburgh. Ahead, the corridor continues deeper into the hidden layers of the city. And somewhere beyond the next bend, another story waits to be discovered. You leave the sounds of children behind as you continue along the corridor. The lanterns near the entrance of the passage flicker gently, and their light grows dimmer with every step you take. The air feels cooler again here, and the ceiling lowers slightly, forcing you to tilt your head a little as you walk. The stone beneath your boots is smoother now, worn by decades of footsteps. It is easy to imagine how many people have walked this exact path before you. Workers returning from the docks, women carrying baskets of food, children racing through the passage long after they were meant to be asleep. You round a gentle bend in the corridor and begin to notice a subtle change. The underground city feels quieter here. The rooms you passed earlier were lively with conversation, laughter, and small household tasks. This section carries a different mood. The voices you hear are softer. Doors are closed more often than open. You pass one chamber where a narrow slit in the wall allows a faint ribbon of moonlight to slip inside. A man sits beside that pale beam reading a small book by the combined light of the moon and a candle. His lips move slowly as he traces the words with a careful finger. Literacy was slowly becoming more common in Scotland during the 19th century, especially compared with many other parts of Europe. Parish schools and church education had long encouraged reading among ordinary people. Even in crowded districts of Edinburgh, many residents valued the ability to read newspapers, pamphlets, or religious texts whenever they had the opportunity. The reader barely notices you as you pass. His attention remains fixed on the page. Farther along the corridor, you come upon a low wooden bench pressed against the wall. A young woman sits there with her head resting briefly against the cool stone behind her. Her eyes are closed, though she is not fully asleep. A basket of folded cloth rests beside her feet. Exhaustion is a familiar companion in places like this. Long work days above ground often stretch from early morning until late evening. Once home, many residents still have cooking, mending, or washing to complete before rest can begin. You move quietly so as not to disturb her. A little farther along the passage, the air shifts again as you approach a stairwell that climbs toward the surface. The opening above allows a small draft to flow downward, carrying faint sounds from the streets. You pause halfway up the steps. Somewhere outside, a carriage rolls slowly across the cobblestones. The muffled rhythm of hooves echoes down the stairwell like distant thunder. A few voices drift through the opening as people pass the entrance of the close. Then the sounds fade. It reminds you how thin the boundary can be between the respectable streets above and the shadowed vaults below. Observers writing about Edinburgh during the Victorian period often remarked upon this strange contrast. Elegant drawing rooms could exist only a few floors above crowded lodging houses where entire families struggle to survive in a single chamber. You descend the stairwell again, returning to the deeper vaults. The next corridor widens slightly and reveals another chamber illuminated by two lanterns. This room appears more organised than many you have seen tonight. Wooden crates line the walls in careful rows, each marked with chalk symbols. At the centre of the chamber stands a narrow table covered with papers. A middle-aged man bends over the table, counting small coins and making notes with a stub of pencil. His brow furrows with concentration as he tallies the numbers. Money moves through the underground city just like anywhere else. Rent must be paid even for rooms beneath the streets. Small trades require supplies. Food must be purchased from markets above. In neighbourhoods like this, informal bookkeeping often helped families track shared expenses. The man glances up briefly and offers a polite nod before returning to his calculations. An intriguing story, sometimes repeated by local guides, tells of hidden storage vaults beneath parts of the Old Town that were once used for secret trading after dark. According to the tale, smugglers occasionally moved untaxed goods through underground passages to avoid watchful city officials. Whether such stories reflect common practice or simply colourful rumour remains uncertain. Still, the twisting corridors certainly make the idea feel possible. You continue past this chamber and enter another stretch of corridor where the lantern light grows sparse again. The stone arches seem heavier here. Each step echoes a little longer. Some historians continue to examine how extensive the network of vaults beneath Edinburgh might once have been. Over centuries, renovations and street construction sealed many passages. What survives today may represent only a portion of the original layout. Walking through these corridors, you can easily imagine additional tunnels branching off beyond the visible walls. The underground city feels less like a single structure and more like a puzzle missing several pieces. You follow the corridor until another chamber appears ahead, its doorway framed by a hanging cloth curtain. Soft music drifts from inside. It takes you a moment to recognise the sound. Someone is playing a fiddle. You push the curtain aside slightly and peer into the room. A small group of residents sit gathered around a lantern while an older man plays a gentle melody. The notes echo beautifully against the curved ceiling, filling the chamber with a sound far richer than you might expect in such a humble setting. A woman taps her foot quietly to the rhythm. Another listener leans back with eyes closed, letting the music wash through the room. Moments like this remind you that comfort can appear even in the most unlikely places. The tune continues for several minutes before drifting into silence. You step away from the doorway and return to the corridor, letting the final notes fade behind you. Ahead, the passage slopes downward once more. A warmer glow flickers along the walls, suggesting another fire burning somewhere deeper in the underground maze. You take a steady breath and continue forward. The hidden city beneath Edinburgh still holds many rooms waiting to be discovered. The music fades behind you as you continue along the corridor, the final notes of the fiddle dissolving into the steady hush of the underground passages. The lantern in your hand swings gently with each step, throwing soft light across the curved brick ceiling above. Shadows drift along the walls like slow-moving clouds. The passage slopes downward again. You begin to notice something different about the air here. It feels heavier, and the smell changes in a way that is difficult to ignore. Coal smoke still lingers, but another scent has joined it. Damp earth, stagnant water, something faintly sour that clings to the stone. You follow the corridor until it opens into a narrow chamber where a shallow channel runs along the floor. Water trickles slowly through it. The stream is not much more than a thin ribbon moving between stones, yet the sound echoes gently against the walls. A wooden plank bridges the channel so people can cross without stepping into the murky water. You pause for a moment to listen. Drip, drip, drip. It seems the underground city has its own small rivers. Old municipal reports, written during the 19th century, often describe the constant struggle of managing water and waste in Edinburgh's Old Town. The steep landscape made drainage complicated, and many buildings relied on simple gutters or stone channels to carry wastewater downhill through the closes. Sometimes those channels continued into the underground vaults. You cross the plank carefully and enter the next passage. Here the corridor narrows once more, its ceiling low enough that taller visitors would need to duck. Candles burn inside small wall niches, their flames wavering whenever someone passes. A door stands open ahead. Inside the room, several wooden buckets sit arranged beside the wall. A young boy fills them slowly, using a ladle from a large barrel of water, Each bucket receives only a small amount before he moves on to the next. Water must be rationed carefully in places like this. In many crowded districts during the Victorian era, clean water arrived through public pumps rather than private pipes. Residents carried buckets up and down stairways throughout the day, sometimes waiting in long lines for their turn at the pump. The boy continues his work, patiently dipping the ladle again and again. You step quietly away so as not to distract him. Farther down the corridor, another chamber glows with lantern light. The smell here grows stronger still, and when you step inside, you begin to understand why. Several residents are scrubbing the stone floor with stiff brushes, while another pours water along the shallow drainage channel. The mixture flows slowly toward the far end of the room, where a narrow opening leads deeper into the underground system. Cleaning the space is clearly a regular task. Living underground means fighting constantly against dampness and grime. Without careful effort, the chambers would quickly become unpleasant places to inhabit. A woman kneeling near the channel wrings out a cloth and glances up briefly as you pass. Her sleeves are rolled to the elbows and droplets of water cling to the stone floor around her knees. The work continues quietly. One interesting observation recorded by a visitor in the 1840s describes how certain underground residents developed clever methods for keeping their rooms relatively clean, despite the difficult environment. Buckets of sand were sometimes scattered across damp floors before sweeping, helping absorb moisture and remove stubborn dirt. The technique seems simple but effective. You continue across the chamber and into another corridor beyond. The smell gradually fades as the air becomes slightly cooler again. A small draught drifts through the passage, likely coming from another stairwell somewhere above. Your lantern light reveals chalk marks along the wall. Someone has drawn arrows pointing towards different corridors, perhaps as a guide for navigating the maze of vaults. The underground city has grown complicated over the years, and even regular residents may occasionally lose their way among the repeating arches. You follow one of the chalk arrows and soon arrive at a small landing where two corridors intersect. From one direction comes the faint sound of coughing. From the other, the gentle murmur of conversation. You choose the quieter path. The corridor curves gradually until it opens into a room where several beds have been arranged along the walls. Straw mattresses lie beneath thin blankets. A lantern burns near the centre of the chamber, casting warm light over the resting figures. Some people sleep already. Others sit upright, speaking softly in low voices so as not to disturb their neighbours. Illness spreads easily in crowded housing, and rest becomes precious whenever it can be found. Physicians writing about urban living conditions during the mid-19th century often warned that cramped rooms and poor airflow allowed coughs and fevers to linger for weeks. The quiet atmosphere here feels fragile. You walk slowly so your footsteps do not wake anyone. Near the far wall, an older man sits awake beside his bedding. He holds a small cup of steaming tea between his hands, letting the warmth drift into his fingers. For a moment he gazes at the lantern flame as if lost in thought. Then he notices you and offers a gentle nod. You return the gesture before moving on. Just beyond the sleeping chamber, another passage leads deeper beneath the city. The bricks here appear older still, their surfaces rougher and darker from years of soot and dampness. Researchers studying Edinburgh's buried structures have often remarked that the vaults beneath the Old Town represent several different building phases layered together. Some sections date back to the late 18th century, while others were altered or expanded during later construction projects. The result is a patchwork network of chambers and corridors whose exact layout remains difficult to map completely. Standing here in the dim lantern light, you can easily believe it. The underground city feels endless. You follow the corridor until a faint orange glow appears ahead. Firelight flickers against the brick walls, and the distant sound of voices reaches your ears once more. Another gathering place waits just beyond the next arch. You adjust the lantern in your hand and continue forward into the warmth, leaving the quiet sleeping chamber behind, as the underground world of Victorian Edinburgh unfolds yet again. You step towards the orange glow ahead, and the corridor slowly widens until it opens into a chamber warmed by several small fires. The light from the flames dances across the brick ceiling in restless patterns. Shadows ripple along the curved arches, as if the stone itself were breathing quietly in the dark. The warmth feels welcome after the damp chill of the passage behind you. Several people sit around the nearest fire, holding bowls or tin cups in their hands. Their voices drift through the room in low conversation. Someone chuckles softly, while another person stirs the contents of a pot suspended above the flames. You pause near the entrance, letting the calm scene settle around you. The pot gives off a simple smell, cabbage perhaps with a hint of barley, the sort of meal that appears often in working households across the city. Writings from Edinburgh residents during the middle of the 19th century frequently describe meals that looked much like this one. Simple broths and stews stretched modest ingredients into food that could feed several people at once. In neighbourhoods where wages were uncertain, stretching a pot of soup was a skill almost everyone learned. A man near the fire lifts the lid of the pot and peers inside. Satisfied, he sets it back again and stirs slowly with a wooden spoon. Across the chamber, another group gathers around a rough wooden table where a lantern burns beside a stack of folded cloth. A woman carefully measures fabric while speaking quietly with a young apprentice who records numbers in a small notebook. Trade continues even after dark. You walk slowly along the wall, careful not to disturb anyone's work. The chamber seems to function as a kind of shared meeting place for several nearby vaults. People drift in and out through the different corridors, pausing to warm themselves before continuing on their way. Near one pillar stands a rack of tools leaning against the brick. Shovels, iron hooks, and a pair of worn lanterns rest there, waiting for their next use. The underground world beneath Edinburgh depends heavily on tools like these. Maintaining fires, moving supplies, clearing drainage channels. Every small task requires effort. A curious detail from an old local memoir describes how some underground residents developed informal schedules for maintaining shared spaces. One family might sweep the corridors in the morning, while another tended the fires in the evening. These arrangements were rarely written down, but help keep the vaults livable. You pass the tool rack and move toward the far side of the chamber. The air here feels slightly warmer still, likely because the fires have burned for several hours already. The stone floor holds a faint memory of heat beneath your boots. A man sitting near the wall lifts a small tin whistle to his lips and begins playing a slow tune. The melody floats gently through the chamber, weaving between the quiet conversations and the soft bubbling of the soup pot. Music seems to find its way into nearly every gathering place, even here. Visitors to the Old Town during the Victorian era often commented on the strong presence of music in working-class neighbourhoods. Fiddles, whistles, and simple songs provided entertainment that cost nothing but a little breath and time. The whistle tune continues for several minutes before fading into the quiet hum of voices again. You notice a narrow archway leading away from the chamber. The passage beyond slopes gently upward, and faint air currents drift down through it. You follow the corridor. As you walk, the warmth of the gathering hall fades behind you and the cooler underground air returns. Lantern light flickers along the walls, illuminating bricks that appear older and more uneven than those near the main chamber. Soon the passage leads to another small room. This one feels less lively. 2 wooden benches line the walls, and a narrow table sits beneath a lantern at the centre of the space. A few residents sit quietly there, speaking in low voices about matters that sound practical rather than social. Rent, food prices, a neighbour who has fallen ill. Such conversations filled many evenings in crowded districts of Victorian cities. Life required constant planning, when wages were uncertain and living conditions demanded careful cooperation. You sit quietly for a moment listening. One man taps the table gently while explaining how the cost of coal has risen again this winter. Another suggests pooling money to purchase a larger supply before the cold deepens further. The discussion continues with thoughtful nods. Historical housing reports compiled during the 19th century reveal that the Old Town's population density often shocked reformers who visited from other parts of Britain. Entire stairwells sometimes held dozens of families living only a few steps apart. That pressure pushed some residents to seek space wherever it could be found, including the forgotten vaults beneath the streets. You stand and move toward the doorway once more. The corridor outside curves gradually downward again, disappearing into shadow where only a faint lantern glow waits. As you follow the passage, the sound of the discussion fades behind you. The underground labyrinth continues to unfold, one chamber at a time. Your lantern light reveals another stairwell ahead, this one leading even deeper beneath the city. The steps are worn and slightly uneven, suggesting they have carried many years of footsteps. You pause at the top. From somewhere far above, the distant sound of a church bell drifts faintly through the stone. It must be late now, but beneath the streets of Edinburgh, the night is still very much alive. You adjust the lantern in your hand and begin descending once again into the darker vaults below. You begin down the worn stairway, placing your feet carefully on each uneven step. The lantern in your hand throws a warm circle of light that slides slowly down the curved walls as you descend. The stone here feels older somehow. The edges of the steps have been rounded by countless years of use, and the mortar between the bricks shows thin cracks where dampness has settled. The deeper you go, the quieter the air becomes. Even the distant murmur of the gathering chamber above fades, until only your own footsteps echo through the stairwell. At the bottom, the passage opens into another corridor, where a few lanterns burn in iron brackets fixed to the walls. Their light flickers gently in the still air. You move forward. The corridor slopes slightly downward, and the smell of smoke drifts toward you again. It is softer here, less sharp than the coal smoke near the workrooms above. Instead, it carries the comforting scent of burning peat and warm tea. Soon the passage opens into a modest chamber. Several wooden stools surround a low table where a kettle sits beside a lantern. Two elderly women sit there wrapped in shawls, speaking quietly while steam curls from their cups. They pause when you enter, offering friendly nods. Moments like this feel almost peaceful compared with the busier vaults you explored earlier. The conversation flows slowly with long pauses between sentences as each woman warms her hands against the cup she holds. The quiet reminds you that the underground city holds many different rhythms. Some rooms hum with work. Others simply offer a place to rest. Records written by Edinburgh officials during the 19th century describe how the Old Town's population included many elderly residents who had lived in the same neighbourhoods for decades. When younger workers moved toward newer districts, some older tenants remained in the older buildings where rents stayed lower. It is easy to imagine that some eventually found their way into vaults like these. One of the women lifts the kettle and pours a little more tea into her cup. The steam drifts upward into the lantern light. Across the chamber, a narrow shelf holds several small jars filled with dried herbs. Their faint, earthy scent mixes pleasantly with the warmth of the tea. You move quietly through the room, careful not to interrupt their conversation. Beyond the chamber, Another corridor stretches deeper beneath the city. This one appears slightly wider than the previous passages. The ceiling arches high overhead, and the bricks form a repeating pattern that guides your eye forward. Your footsteps echo gently again. Along the wall, you notice several hooks where lanterns once hung. Only one remains lit tonight, leaving parts of the corridor in deep shadow. The underground labyrinth feels endless. A small detail mentioned in a visitor's letter from the 1840s describes how newcomers often became disoriented in these vaults because the repeating arches looked so similar. Without familiar landmarks, it was surprisingly easy to walk in circles beneath the city. You glance back briefly at the chamber you just left, making sure you remember the direction. Then you continue. After a few turns, the corridor opens into a long room lined with wooden cots. Thin blankets cover the straw mattresses, and several figures lie resting beneath them. A lantern burns low at the far end. The atmosphere here is hushed. Only the soft sound of breathing and the occasional rustle of blankets breaks the silence. You step carefully along the wall. Sleeping rooms like this were common in crowded working districts during the Victorian period. Many families shared limited space, and lodging houses sometimes offered simple beds for labourers who could not afford private rooms. Even underground people created places where rest could be found. Near one of the cots, a man sits upright, polishing a pair of boots with a cloth. He works slowly so as not to wake the others. When he notices you, he offers a brief smile before returning to the careful circular motion of the cloth. You continue quietly toward the doorway at the end of the chamber. Beyond it, another passage curves gently upward. A faint draught flows down through the corridor, bringing with it the distant smell of rain. Perhaps the weather has changed above the city. A curious observation, recorded by several 19th century travellers, noted how weather conditions on the surface often influence the underground vaults. Heavy rain sometimes found its way through cracks in the stone, while strong winds could send small currents of air whispering through the tunnels. Tonight the air feels cool but dry. You follow the corridor until the sound of soft voices reaches your ears again. The passage opens into a small room where three men sit beside a lantern, studying a rough map drawn across a sheet of paper. One traces a finger along the lines while explaining something in a quiet voice. Perhaps they are planning work routes through the city streets above. Or perhaps the map shows parts of the underground vaults themselves. Researchers today still attempt to reconstruct the full layout of these buried chambers using scattered historical records and archaeological surveys. Some sections were sealed during later construction projects, leaving only partial clues about how the network once connected. Standing here now, you can easily imagine that much of the underground city remains hidden behind walls that no one has opened in generations. You leave the map readers to their discussion and continue down the next corridor. Your lantern light reveals another staircase ahead. This one appears older still, its bricks darkened by years of smoke and dampness. The steps descend steeply into shadow, where the glow of another lantern waits somewhere below. You pause at the top. From far above, faint thunder rolls across the city. Perhaps rain has begun falling over Edinburgh. Down here, however, the underground world remains steady and quiet. You take a slow breath and begin descending once more. You continue down the steep stairway, one hand brushing the cold stone wall for balance. The lantern in your grip sways slightly with each step, sending shifting light along the narrow stairwell. The glow reveals bricks that appear darker than those above their surfaces, stained by years of smoke and damp air. The thunder you heard moments ago rolls faintly again, somewhere far above the city. Down here, the sound reaches you only as a distant rumble. At the bottom of the stairwell, the passage turns sharply and opens into another low corridor. A thin stream of water creeps along the edge of the floor, moving slowly toward a drainage opening farther down the hall. Rain must be falling hard above Edinburgh now. Urban engineers working during the 19th century often struggled with the city's complicated drainage system. The steep slopes of the Old Town helped water run downhill quickly, but heavy storms could still overwhelm gutters and channels. When that happened, water sometimes found its way into the underground vaults. You step over the small stream and continue. The lantern light reveals a series of alcoves along the wall. Each contains small objects arranged carefully on shelves, jars filled with dried herbs, bundles of cloth tied with string, a few metal tools laid out neatly beside a whetstone. It appears someone has organised this corridor as a kind of storage space. At the end of the hall, a wooden door stands open, allowing warm firelight to spill across the floor. The soft glow contrasts with the cool dampness of the corridor behind you. You move toward it. Inside the chamber feels surprisingly comfortable. A small iron stove glows in one corner, its heat spreading through the room in gentle waves. Several chairs sit arranged around a low table where a deck of worn playing cards lies scattered. 4 residents sit there leaning forward as they study the cards in their hands. Their conversation pauses briefly when you step inside. Then the game resumes. Card games were common forms of entertainment in working districts throughout Victorian Britain. After long days of labour, simple games offered an affordable way to pass the evening. A lantern, a deck of cards, and a few friends could transform even the humblest room into a gathering place. One of the players places a card carefully on the table. Another shakes his head and laughs softly. The atmosphere feels relaxed. Near the stove, a kettle warms quietly, while steam curls upward toward the ceiling. The smell of tea blends with the smoky warmth of the iron firebox. You linger beside the doorway for a moment before moving on. Beyond the card room, another passage branches away into darker sections of the vault network. The corridor slopes slightly upward, suggesting it may lead toward the surface again. But after a few turns, you realise the path actually curves beneath another section of the Old Town. The underground labyrinth seems determined to keep its secrets. A curious remark preserved in a guidebook from the late 19th century describes how visitors occasionally compared these vaults to a buried town of their own. Corridors served as streets, while chambers became houses, workshops, and meeting places. Walking through them tonight, the comparison feels surprisingly accurate. The passage widens into another vaulted hall, supported by thick stone pillars. Lanterns hang from several iron hooks along the walls, illuminating rows of wooden barrels stacked neatly beside one another. 2 workers move quietly between the barrels, checking their markings. Storage remains one of the original purposes of many vaults like these. Merchants once relied on the cool underground temperatures to preserve goods before refrigeration existed. Even after some spaces became homes, others continued functioning as storage rooms for nearby businesses. One worker lifts a lantern to read a chalk symbol on a barrel's lid. Satisfied, he replaces it and continues down the row. You cross the hall toward a narrow doorway at the far end. Beyond it lies a smaller chamber where a young woman sits beside a table covered with folded papers. She writes carefully using a short pencil, pausing occasionally to count coins placed in small stacks beside her elbow. Bookkeeping takes place even here beneath the streets. The careful record of income and expenses helps many families survive in uncertain economic conditions. A few historical researchers examining life in Edinburgh's Old Town have noted that informal economies often thrived in crowded neighbourhoods. Small trades, shared work, and careful accounting allowed residents to stretch limited resources much further than outsiders might expect. The woman glances up briefly as you pass. She offers a polite nod before returning to her calculations. You step back into the corridor and continue deeper into the network. The air grows cooler again as the passage curves away from the warmth of the storage hall. The lantern light reveals patches of moisture glistening on the bricks where rainwater has seeped through from above. Somewhere in the distance you hear the faint sound of dripping water echoing through another chamber. The underground city feels alive in its own quiet way. Even storms above seem to filter gently through the stone like distant whispers. You follow the corridor until another stairway appears ahead. This one climbs upward toward a narrow opening where faint daylight once might have entered during earlier hours. Now only the dim glow of a street lantern filters down through the top of the shaft. You pause on the lowest step. The storm above has grown stronger. Rain taps softly against the stone opening far overhead, and a cool draught slides down the stairwell, carrying the fresh scent of wet air. For a moment you simply listen. The underground world continues behind you with its lanterns and quiet voices. Above, the city of Edinburgh moves through a rainy night. You take another breath and begin climbing slowly toward the faint light waiting above the vaults. You climb the first few steps toward the narrow opening above, listening to the gentle tapping of rain striking the stone at the top of the shaft. Cool air drifts down through the stairwell, carrying the clean scent of wet night. For a moment, the underground city feels almost refreshed by it. The lantern in your hand throws a soft circle of light across the steps. Halfway up, you pause and glance toward the opening. A slice of the outside world becomes visible there. Rain glitters briefly as it falls past the mouth of the close. Somewhere beyond the buildings, a carriage rolls by, its wheels splashing through shallow puddles along the cobbled street. The city above continues moving through its ordinary routines even in bad weather. You remain there for a moment longer, listening, then curiosity draws you back down again. You turn and descend the stairwell once more, returning to the dim warmth of the underground passages. The rain sound fades quickly behind you until only the familiar hush of stone corridors remains. At the base of the steps, another passage curves gently away into darkness. Your lantern light glides along the walls as you follow it. The corridor soon opens into a modest chamber where several narrow tables have been arranged beside the wall. A single lantern burns in the centre, illuminating stacks of folded paper ink bottles and a few carefully sharpened pencils. Two men sit there speaking quietly while studying a map spread across the table. One traces the route of a line drawn across the page, while the other nods thoughtfully. Their conversation seems practical rather than secretive. They speak of deliveries of storage rooms and of which vaults remain dry after heavy rain. In places like this, knowing the layout of the underground passages can be extremely useful. City improvement records from the 19th century show that many sections of Edinburgh's Old Town were altered repeatedly as streets were rebuilt and bridges extended. Each new project created additional arches and vaults beneath the surface. Over time, these structures formed a complicated network that few individuals understood completely. Looking at the map, you begin to see why careful planning would be necessary. You move quietly along the edge of the room so as not to interrupt their discussion. Beyond the chamber, another corridor stretches forward beneath a long brick arch. The floor slopes gently downward again, and the faint scent of damp stone grows stronger as you walk. The lantern glow reveals patches where the mortar between bricks has been repaired more than once. These vaults have endured many years of use. As the corridor bends, you notice a small wooden door standing partly open. Warm light spills out through the gap, and a low murmur of voices reaches your ears. You push the door gently. Inside, a small group of women sits around a low fire placed carefully within a metal basin. A kettle hangs above the flames and several cups rest on a nearby crate. They are sharing tea. One woman speaks while the others listen closely. Her hands move slowly as she tells a story that seems to hold their full attention. From the occasional smile that appears around the circle, you gather that the tale may contain a touch of humour. Even underground evenings still include conversation and storytelling. One traveller who visited Edinburgh during the 1830s wrote about hearing tales pass between residents of the Old Town after sunset. According to his account, stories about strange happenings in hidden corners of the city were particularly popular. You lean quietly against the doorframe and listen. The storyteller lowers her voice slightly as she reaches the most dramatic part of the tale. Something about footsteps heard in an empty vault late at night. Something about a lantern that appeared where no one was supposed to be. The listeners exchange amused looks. It seems the underground city has its share of ghost stories as well. You slip away before the end of the tale and return to the corridor. The passage ahead widens into another vaulted hall supported by thick stone pillars. Several lanterns hang along the walls, casting warm circles of light across the floor. At the centre of the hall stands a wooden cart loaded with sacks of grain. Two workers lift the sacks carefully, carrying them toward a storage room at the far end of the hall. Their movements are steady but slow. Grain is heavy, and the damp underground air makes the work even more tiring. Merchants in the 19th century often relied on underground vaults for storing goods, because the cool environment helped preserve food supplies longer than open warehouses above ground. Even after some vaults became living spaces, others continued serving their original purpose. You step aside as one worker passes. The sack across his shoulder shifts slightly with the weight. After they disappear into the storage room, the hall grows quiet again. You walk toward the far side where another corridor begins. The lantern light fades gradually as you enter the passage. Only a single flame burns near the next archway, leaving the corners of the corridor wrapped in shadow. Some researchers who study Edinburgh's buried structures suggest that parts of this underground network may once have connected to additional vaults that no longer exist today. Over centuries of construction, demolition, and rebuilding, entire sections were sealed or collapsed. That possibility adds a certain mystery to every dark corridor. You reach the archway and pause. Beyond it, another chamber glows faintly with firelight. The soft sound of a fiddle drifts toward you once again, accompanied by quiet conversation. It seems music has found another corner of the underground city tonight. You adjust the lantern in your hand and step forward toward the warm glow, leaving the silent corridor behind as the hidden world beneath Victorian Edinburgh continues to unfold. You move toward the soft glow ahead, and the sound of the fiddle grows clearer with each step. The corridor opens gradually until you reach a chamber warmed by a small fire set inside a shallow iron basin. The flames rise and fall gently, casting amber light across the vaulted ceiling. The musician sits on a low crate near the fire. His bow moves slowly across the strings, drawing out a melody that echoes through the chamber with surprising richness. The curved brick ceiling seems to hold the sound for a moment before letting it drift away into the adjoining passages. Several listeners sit nearby. Some lean against the wall, while others rest on wooden stools, their hands wrapped around cups of tea. The music appears to require no formal audience. Anyone passing through may pause and enjoy a few minutes of quiet entertainment. You remain near the entrance, letting the tunes settle around you. Life in the Old Town during the 19th century often included moments like this. Residents of crowded districts relied on simple pleasures for relaxation after demanding workdays. A fiddle, a whistle, or even a shared song could transform an ordinary room into a place of warmth. The musician finishes the melody with a gentle flourish. A few quiet claps follow. Someone asks for another tune. He nods and lifts the bow again. As the second melody begins, you slip quietly back into the corridor. The passage curves away from the music, and the notes fade slowly behind you. Your lantern light returns to being the only steady glow along the walls. Soon you arrive at another chamber where several long tables stand beneath hanging lanterns. The room appears busier than most you have visited tonight. Men and women sit along the tables sorting small items into wooden boxes. Buttons, metal clasps, tiny brass fittings used for clothing and equipment. Each person works with careful attention while speaking quietly with the neighbour beside them. Factories in Victorian cities often produced large quantities of small goods that required hand finishing before they could be sold. Workers sometimes carried these tasks home in order to earn a little extra income. In crowded neighbourhoods like the Old Town, shared workrooms allowed several people to complete such jobs together. The gentle clink of metal pieces against the wooden tables fills the room with a steady rhythm. You walk slowly along the edge of the chamber. Near one lantern, a young apprentice counts finished pieces into a cloth bag. His lips move silently as he keeps track of the numbers. At the far end of the room, a woman folds completed items into neat bundles tied with string. Everyone seems absorbed in their work. A curious detail preserved in an old newspaper article once described how certain trades quietly relied on these informal workrooms scattered through poorer districts of Edinburgh. Goods assembled in humble settings like this sometimes ended up in shops along the city's busiest streets. The path from underground chamber to storefront could be surprisingly short. You continue through the room and enter another corridor beyond. The passage slopes gently upward, and the air feels a little cooler here. Somewhere ahead, a faint draft suggests another connection with the outside world. As you walk, your lantern reveals chalk marks along the bricks once again. Arrows, numbers, perhaps directions for navigating the twisting passages. Without such guides, it would be easy to become lost among the repeating arches. The corridor eventually opens into a smaller room where several crates sit stacked beside the wall. A narrow window shaft rises toward the street above, allowing a pale glow from a gas lamp to filter faintly down into the chamber. You look up through the shaft. Rain continues to fall outside. Drops streak past the opening, occasionally catching the light as they descend. A travel writer who visited Edinburgh in the 1840s once remarked that the city seemed to contain two different atmospheres at once. Above-ground wind and rain swept across the hilltop streets. Beneath the arches, the air remained still and dim, almost like the interior of a cavern. Standing here now, the description feels perfectly accurate. You leave the shaft behind and continue through another archway. The next chamber appears quieter than the previous workroom. Several shelves line the walls filled with jars containing dried plants and powders. A faint herbal fragrance lingers in the air. A woman stands at a table grinding something with a small mortar and pestle. She works patiently, her lantern casting a soft glow across the jars. People in crowded districts often relied on home remedies for minor illnesses or injuries. Herbs, teas, and simple salves were common forms of treatment long before modern pharmacies became widespread. You watch for a moment as she pours the ground mixture into a small paper packet. After sealing it carefully, she places it beside several similar bundles waiting on the shelf. Your footsteps draw her attention briefly. She smiles politely before returning to her work. You move on once more. The corridor ahead curves downward again, its lantern light fading into deeper shadow. The underground network seems to stretch endlessly beneath the city. Some historians studying Edinburgh's past have suggested that parts of this buried world were gradually forgotten as the city modernised. New buildings improved sanitation systems, and changing housing patterns eventually reduced the need for living spaces beneath the streets. Yet in the middle of the 19th century, the underground vault still held many lives. You walk until the corridor reaches another stone stairway. This one descends deeply into darkness, where the faint glow of another fire flickers below. You pause at the top. The music from the earlier chamber has faded completely now. Only the distant crackle of flames rises from the vault beneath the stairs. You lift your lantern slightly higher and begin descending again into the deeper levels of the underground city. You descend the stairway slowly, one careful step at a time. The lantern in your hand lights only a small circle ahead, leaving the rest of the stairwell wrapped in quiet shadow. The sound of your boots echoes faintly against the brick walls. At the bottom, the air feels warmer again. A soft orange glow flickers from the chamber ahead, and the faint crackle of burning wood reaches your ears. When you step through the archway, you find a room centred around a modest fire. Several women sit nearby with baskets of laundry arranged around them. Steam rises from a large iron pot placed beside the flames. One woman lifts a cloth from the hot water and wrings it carefully, before hanging it across a rope stretched between two hooks in the wall. The fabric drips slowly into a wooden basin placed underneath. Washing clothes in places like this requires patience. In 19th century Edinburgh, many working households lacked private washing facilities. Shared washing areas or improvised setups like this one were common throughout crowded neighbourhoods. Boiling water over a fire helped remove dirt from garments worn during long days of labour. The warm scent of soap drifts through the chamber. You watch quietly as the women continue their work. One of them folds a finished shirt and places it neatly into a basket. Another scrubs a stubborn stain with steady determination. Their conversation moves easily between practical matters and gentle humour. Laundry day seems to provide a moment for talking as well as working. Near the wall, a small child sits beside a stack of folded cloth, watching the activity with sleepy curiosity. The glow from the fire reflects softly in the child's eyes. You move slowly across the room. A narrow shelf above the fire holds several metal kettles and jars filled with coarse soap flakes. These simple supplies help maintain a small sense of order within the underground chambers. One curious remark preserved in an old household guide mentions that residents of crowded urban districts sometimes shared washing tasks to save time and fuel. Several families might gather around a single fire rather than each struggling alone with limited resources. The arrangement you see here seems to follow that practical idea. You step through another doorway beyond the laundry room. The corridor outside feels cooler again, though the warmth of the fire still lingers faintly behind you. Lantern light glows along the walls at regular intervals, guiding your path through the twisting passages. Your footsteps carry you into another chamber where a group of women sits around a table covered with vegetables, cabbages, carrots, a small pile of onions. Each woman works steadily with a knife, slicing the vegetables into a large pot waiting at the centre of the table. The sound of chopping fills the room with a calm rhythm. Food preparation in communities like this often becomes a shared effort. Larger pots allow several families to cook meals together while conserving fuel and ingredients. A city survey conducted during the Victorian period noted that many working-class households relied on cooperative arrangements to stretch their food supplies. Shared cooking, shared storage, and shared meals helped make difficult living conditions slightly easier to manage. One woman lifts a handful of chopped cabbage and drops it into the pot. Another sprinkles a pinch of salt. The mixture will likely simmer for hours before it is ready to eat. You pause near the doorway for a moment before moving on. Beyond the cooking room, another corridor curves gently beneath a series of arches. Your lantern light reveals faint chalk markings along the walls again, perhaps left by residents who use these passages regularly. The underground network feels like a maze built from repeating shapes. Every few steps, the corridor seems to open into another room, another small corner where life continues quietly beneath the city. Soon you reach a chamber where several wooden cradles stand near the wall. Two mothers sit nearby, rocking the cradles gently. Soft lullabies drift through the room as they hum simple melodies to soothe the infants inside. The lantern light glows warmly across the blankets draped over the small beds. Even underground families find ways to create moments of comfort. Observers who wrote about Edinburgh's poorer districts during the 19th century often express surprise at how much care parents invested in their children, despite the difficult surroundings. Cramped rooms and limited resources did not prevent families from maintaining routines of care and affection. You stand quietly for a moment, listening to the gentle humming. Then you continue. The corridor beyond slopes slightly upward, and the air begins to carry a faint smell of coal smoke again. Somewhere ahead, another fire must be burning. As you approach the next chamber, the glow of flames spreads across the stone floor. Inside, a man tends a small forge. The iron tool he holds glows faintly red as he shapes it with careful hammer strikes against an anvil. Sparks jump briefly with each blow before fading into darkness. Metalwork continues even at this late hour. Tradespeople often used whatever space they could find to maintain their tools and equipment. A small forge like this allows broken items to be repaired rather than replaced, which saves precious money. You watch the craftsman for a moment. His hammer falls in steady rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. Beyond the forge, another corridor stretches deeper beneath the Old Town. Some researchers studying Edinburgh's underground structures suggest that parts of this network extended farther than most people realised during the 19th century. Over time, new constructions sealed certain vaults while leaving others accessible, which means the passages you explore tonight may represent only part of what once existed. You step back into the corridor and follow the lantern light once more. The underground city continues quietly around you, one chamber leading to the next, as the long night beneath Edinburgh carries on. You leave the quiet ringing of the hammer behind and follow the corridor that stretches beyond the little forge. The air grows cooler again, and the lantern light glides over bricks that look darker and older than the ones in the rooms above. The floor slopes gently downward, though only enough that you notice it after several steps. Somewhere far away, water drips in slow intervals. The sound echoes through the passage in a steady rhythm. You move carefully, letting your lantern sweep across the walls as the corridor bends. Before long, it opens into a larger chamber where the ceiling rises higher and the air feels slightly less confined. This room holds only a few pieces of furniture. A long bench runs along one wall. A small table sits near the centre, with lantern glowing beside it. A narrow stove burns quietly in the corner, its small iron door cracked open so that the coals inside glow red. The warmth spreads gently through the chamber. Two women sit on the bench sewing by the lantern light. Their needles flash in the glow as they repair worn coats laid across their laps. Every so often, one pauses to stretch her fingers before continuing. Mending clothing was a constant task for families who could not easily replace garments. Many coat shirts and trousers passed through countless repairs before they were finally worn beyond saving. Visitors walking through Edinburgh's Old Town during the mid-19th century often commented on how carefully residents maintained their belongings. In neighbourhoods where money was scarce, repairing and reusing items became an everyday skill. You watch quietly for a moment. The steady rhythm of stitching fills the room with a calm sense of focus. Near the stove, a kettle warms slowly. The faint scent of tea drifts through the air, mingling with the smoky warmth of the iron fire. You continue toward another archway at the far end of the chamber. The corridor beyond is narrow but well lit. Several lanterns hang from hooks along the wall, suggesting that this passage sees frequent use. As you walk, you notice something unusual carved into the bricks. Names, small initials scratched carefully into the mortar. Some appear fresh, others look so faded that they may have been there for decades. People leaving marks behind them is hardly surprising. In places where many lives pass through the same confined spaces, small gestures of identity become meaningful. A story passed down in local memory tells of workers who once carved their names into certain vault walls as a quiet way of proving they had laboured there. Whether the tale is entirely accurate remains uncertain, but the scattered initials certainly hint at many years of human presence. You follow the corridor until it opens into a hall larger than most you have seen tonight. Tall stone pillars rise from the floor to support the vaulted ceiling above. Lanterns hang from iron brackets, filling the space with warm light. Several wooden carts stand parked along the wall. Their wheels are thick with dried mud from the streets above. In the centre of the hall, 2 men sort through sacks of grain, while another checks markings written on a wooden crate. Their work moves steadily, though the hour must be quite late by now. Grain storage played an important role in feeding the city. Records from Edinburgh's merchants show that supplies often move between warehouses and smaller storage spaces throughout the Old Town before reaching markets or bakeries. Keeping those goods dry and protected from pests required constant attention. You walk slowly along the edge of the hall. The workers glance up briefly but quickly return to their tasks. Beyond the carts, another passage leads deeper into the vault network. You follow it until the lantern light grows softer again. The corridor bends once more and opens into a quieter chamber. Here, several residents sit gathered around a table, listening to a man read aloud from a folded newspaper. The lantern beside him throws light across the printed pages while the listeners lean forward to catch every word. News travels slowly in many parts of the city, especially among those who cannot afford their own copies of printed papers. Reading aloud became a common way to share information. You linger near the doorway while the reader continues. He speaks about shipping arrivals at the port of Leith, then about debates happening in Parliament far to the south in London. The listeners nod thoughtfully. For people living in hidden corners of the Old Town, such moments provide a rare connection to the wider world beyond their immediate surroundings. Researchers examining newspapers from this period often remark on how widely they circulated through shared reading. A single printed sheet might pass through dozens of hands before the week ended. The reader folds the page and sets it aside. Quiet conversation begins among the listeners as they discuss what they have just heard. You slip back into the corridor. The underground air feels calm and steady as you continue walking. Your lantern reveals another staircase descending into deeper shadow. The steps appear worn but solid. Some historians studying Edinburgh's buried structures suggest that the lower vaults were among the earliest sections built beneath the Old Town's bridges and raised streets. Later construction added new layers above them, gradually creating the maze of chambers you have been exploring tonight. You pause at the top of the stairway. From somewhere far above comes the faint sound of rain continuing to fall across the city. Down here, the underground world remains sheltered beneath layers of stone. You take another step downward, lantern held high, and continue into the deeper vaults as the quiet life beneath Victorian Edinburgh carries on around you. You continue down this stairway into the deeper vaults, the lantern light climbing slowly down the walls beside you. Each step carries a faint echo that seems to disappear into the heavy stone around you. The air grows cooler again, and the scent of damp brick becomes stronger. At the bottom of the steps, the passage opens into a narrow corridor where the ceiling arches low overhead. Your lantern casts long shadows that slide across the curved walls as you walk. This part of the underground city feels older. The bricks appear rougher, their surfaces darkened by many years of smoke and moisture. In some places the mortar has been patched, suggesting repairs carried out long after the vaults were first built. You move slowly through the corridor, letting your footsteps fall softly. After a short distance, the passage widens into another chamber where several wooden stools surround a low table. A lantern sits in the centre, its flame steady and bright. 3 men sit there speaking in quiet voices. Their conversation pauses briefly when you enter, then resumes after a polite nod. One of them gestures toward a folded map lying across the table. His finger traces a line that runs beneath several arches before stopping near what appears to be a stairwell. The underground network requires careful knowledge to navigate efficiently. Writings preserved from city improvement committees show that 19th century Edinburgh underwent many rounds of construction and alteration. Bridges were widened, roads were levelled, and new buildings replaced older structures. Each project reshaped parts of the Old Town, sometimes sealing vaults while opening new ones. As a result, even people who worked below ground could occasionally discover unfamiliar passages. You leave the map readers to their discussion and continue along another corridor beyond the chamber. The passage curves gently, and the lantern light begins to reveal chalk symbols along the wall. Numbers appear beside certain doorways, perhaps marking storage rooms or sleeping quarters. One doorway stands open. Inside, several narrow beds line the wall beneath a dim lantern. A few labourers rest there with their coats folded beneath their heads. One man snores softly while another stares quietly at the ceiling. Places to sleep were precious in crowded districts like this. Many workers who could not afford larger rooms relied on shared lodging spaces where simple beds could be rented for the night. You walk quietly past so as not to disturb them. The corridor beyond slopes slightly upward before turning again beneath another arch. The repeating curves of the ceiling make the underground world feel almost endless. As you continue, faint voices drift from a chamber ahead. When you reach the doorway, you find a small group gathered around a fire set within a metal basin. A kettle warms above the flames while several people sit nearby warming their hands. The room carries a calm atmosphere. One man speaks, while the others listen closely. He appears to be telling a story about something that happened in the city streets above earlier that day. Laughter breaks out when he reaches the punchline. Even in hidden spaces beneath the Old Town, news and humour still travel easily. A curious detail recorded by a traveller visiting Edinburgh in the 1830s described hearing laughter echoing through underground vaults late at night. The writer claimed the sound carried so strangely beneath the arches that it seemed to come from several directions at once. Listening now, you can understand how that impression might arise. You remain only a moment before continuing. Another corridor leads away from the firelight and into deeper shadow. Your lantern becomes the only steady source of illumination again as you walk. The air here feels slightly cooler, and the smell of rain drifts faintly through the passage. Somewhere above the storm must still be passing across the city. Soon you arrive at a small landing where 2 stairways branch in different directions. One climbs upward toward a faint glow that might lead back to the surface streets. The other descends farther beneath the Old Town. You pause studying both paths. Researchers who investigate the surviving vaults beneath Edinburgh sometimes remark that the underground structures form something like a layered puzzle. Some sections belong to early bridge foundations, while others were added during later expansions of the city. Standing here between the 2 stairways, it is easy to imagine those layers stretching beneath your feet. You choose the downward path. The steps lead into another vaulted chamber where a single lantern burns beside a stack of wooden crates. Dust covers the lids, suggesting the goods inside may have been stored for quite some time. The chamber feels quiet. Only the distant drip of water echoes faintly from another corridor. You move across the room toward the far doorway. Beyond it, a long passage stretches away beneath a series of repeating arches. The lantern light flickers across the bricks as you begin walking again. Behind you, the chamber fades into shadow. Ahead, the underground city continues to unfold, one corridor at a time, carrying you deeper beneath the streets of Victorian Edinburgh. You continue along the long passage. Beneath the repeating arches, your lantern sending soft light across the damp brick walls. The corridor stretches farther than many of the others you have seen tonight. The steady pattern of arches gives the strange feeling that the tunnel might continue forever if you simply keep walking. Your footsteps echo gently. Somewhere ahead you hear the faint creak of wood, followed by the soft rustle of movement. The passage widens after several turns and opens into a chamber where a wooden cart stands beside a pile of bundled sacks. A lantern hangs from a hook above the cart, illuminating the rough floorboards beneath its wheels. Two workers stand nearby adjusting the ropes around the sacks. One lifts the lantern to inspect a chalk mark on the side of a bundle, while the other tightens the knot holding the load together. Their movements are slow and careful, suggesting that whatever rests inside the sacks must be valuable enough to protect from damage. Grain shipments often pass through hidden storage spaces like these before reaching bakeries or markets. Written records from Edinburgh merchants during the Victorian era show that food supplies moved constantly through the Old Town to meet the needs of a rapidly growing population. Even underground, the flow of goods never fully stops. You step quietly around the cart and continue through another archway at the far end of the chamber. The corridor beyond slopes slightly upward, and the air begins to feel fresher as you walk. A faint current moves through the passage, carrying with it the distant scent of rain-washed streets. Soon you reach a stairwell where thin light filters down from above. You climb several steps and pause halfway. At the top of the shaft, a narrow iron grate covers the opening. Through its bars you can see the blurred glow of a gas lamp standing somewhere along the street. Rain still falls lightly outside, streaking past the grate before disappearing into the darkness. For a moment you listen. Footsteps pass overhead. A carriage rattles along the road. The sounds of the city reach you only faintly through the layers of stone. Travel writers who explored Edinburgh during the 19th century often remarked on this unusual closeness between two very different worlds. Respectable shops and elegant homes might stand only a few feet above vaults, where crowded living conditions told a very different story. You descend the stairwell again, returning to the quiet of the underground. The corridor continues beyond the steps, bending gently until it opens into a broad hall supported by thick pillars. Lanterns glow along the walls, revealing stacks of wooden crates arranged neatly between the columns. This space appears to function almost like a small warehouse. A man walks slowly between the crates, checking their markings against a notebook he carries. Every so often he pauses to adjust a lid or brush dust from the chalk symbols written on the wood. Keeping track of stored goods requires careful attention. Many merchants in Edinburgh relied on detailed records to manage their supplies as they moved through different storage locations. In crowded districts where space was limited, goods might be shifted from one vault to another, depending on weather demand or repairs taking place above ground. You walk quietly along the edge of the hall. Your lantern light glides across the crates as you pass. One interesting story preserved in local folklore describes a merchant who supposedly lost track of an entire shipment of wine somewhere beneath the Old Town. According to the tale, the barrels were discovered years later in a forgotten vault after workers accidentally broke through a sealed wall. Whether the story is entirely true or not, the idea of hidden chambers beneath these passages does not seem impossible. The underground network feels full of places where forgotten things might rest quietly for years. You leave the storage hall through another corridor at the far side. The passage narrows again, its ceiling dropping low enough that you instinctively duck slightly as you walk. Moisture glistens on the bricks where rainwater has seeped through tiny cracks above. Your lantern light catches the droplets, making them shine briefly before fading again. After several turns, the corridor opens into a smaller chamber where a few residents sit around a lantern discussing the events of the day. One man gestures animatedly while describing something he witnessed in the market earlier that morning. The others listen with quiet interest. Conversations like these often carried news through neighbourhoods where many people could not afford their own newspapers. Stories, rumours and small observations pass from person to person until the entire district seemed to know them. You remain only a moment before continuing. Beyond the chamber, the corridor curves again, leading toward another stairway, descending deeper beneath the Old Town. Your lantern light reveals the first few steps disappearing into shadow. Researchers studying Edinburgh's buried structures sometimes remark that the surviving vaults represent only a portion of what once existed. Over centuries of construction, many chambers were sealed or collapsed as new buildings rose above them. Standing here now, it feels as though the underground city still holds secrets waiting somewhere in the darkness. You pause at the top of the stairs. The lantern flame trembles slightly in your hand. Then you begin descending once more into the deeper vaults beneath Victorian Edinburgh. You descend the stairway slowly, the lantern in your hand casting a small circle of gold across the steps. Each footfall echoes softly, fading into the quiet spaces beneath the city. The air here feels heavier than in the vaults above, as though the weight of the streets and buildings presses gently down through the stone. When you reach the bottom, the passage stretches ahead beneath a series of older arches. The bricks appear darker here, and the mortar between them shows the careful patches of repairs made long ago. Your lantern light glides across the walls, revealing the subtle curves of the ceiling where the arch meets the corridor. The underground city seems calmer at this depth. Fewer voices reach you now. The distant murmur of activity has softened into occasional footsteps or the faint scrape of a chair somewhere far away. You walk slowly forward. After several turns, the corridor opens into a modest chamber where a small fire burns inside an iron basin. Its glow spreads gently across the room, warming the damp air. A man sits beside the flames, with his coat wrapped tightly around his shoulders. He appears to be finishing the last of a simple meal from a tin bowl. When he notices you, he gives a polite nod before returning his attention to the fire. Moments like this often mark the quiet end of the day. Accounts written by city inspectors during the mid-19th century describe how many residents of the Old Town worked extremely long hours before returning to their homes in the evening. Labour at docks, markets and workshops could stretch well past sunset, leaving only a small portion of the night for rest. You move quietly past the fire. Beyond the chamber, another passage leads deeper through the stone. The lantern reveals faint scratches along the wall where someone long ago carved small symbols into the bricks. Some resemble initials, others appear to mark directions through the corridors. It is easy to imagine how confusing these passages might become without such guides. A curious tale preserved in local tradition speaks of a young delivery boy who once became lost among the vaults while carrying supplies between storage rooms. According to the story, he wandered for nearly an hour before finally recognizing a chalk mark that pointed him back toward the correct corridor. Whether the story happened exactly that way is impossible to know, but the maze of arches certainly makes it believable. You continue walking. The corridor bends gradually until it opens into a larger hall supported by thick stone pillars. Several lanterns hang from hooks along the walls, their light flickering gently against the bricks. Only a few people remain awake here now. A pair of workers sit beside a cart loaded with crates, speaking quietly while sharing a cup of tea. Their voices carry softly across the hall. The atmosphere feels slower than earlier rooms you visited tonight. Most of the underground city seems to be settling into sleep. You cross the hall and pause beside one of the pillars. The lantern glow reflects from the metal rim of the cart wheel. The crates stacked nearby bear faded chalk markings that once guided their storage and delivery. Merchants and labourers relied heavily on spaces like these to manage supplies. Records from the period show that Edinburgh's busy trade networks required storage areas scattered throughout the Old Town, especially before large modern warehouses became common. Even the hidden vaults beneath the streets played a role in keeping the city fed and supplied. You leave the hall through another narrow corridor. The passage curves gently upward this time, and after several steps you notice the air becoming slightly cooler. A faint draft slips down through the bricks ahead. Soon you reach a small stairway, climbing toward another shaft that connects to the surface. You climb partway up. At the top, an iron grate covers the opening just as you saw earlier. Through its narrow bars you glimpse the faint glow of dawn beginning to lighten the sky beyond the rooftops. The rain has stopped. Drops still cling to the stones above, but the air carries that quiet freshness that often arrives before sunrise. You remain there for a moment listening. A distant wagon rolls along the street. Somewhere a door creaks open. The city above is beginning to stir again. Travellers who passed through Edinburgh during this era sometimes wrote about the strange experience of hearing the morning come to life while standing beneath the streets. From below, the first sounds of the day arrived as distant echoes filtering through layers of stone. Standing here now, the sensation feels exactly as those descriptions suggest. You descend the steps again. The lantern in your hand casts warm light across the walls as you return to the deeper corridor. The underground city still sleeps quietly in many of its chambers. Soon, however, the first workers will begin rising for the day. Fires will be lit. Buckets will be carried to the pumps. Carts will roll through the vaults carrying supplies toward the markets above. You walk slowly along the passage, knowing that your journey beneath the Old Town is nearing its end. Ahead, another corridor curves toward the final chambers of the underground city. The lantern glow leads the way forward through the quiet stone halls. You follow the corridor as it curves gently toward the final chambers of the underground city. The lantern in your hand glows softly now, its light moving across the damp brick walls in slow, steady arcs. The passages feel quieter than ever, as though the stone itself has settled into a kind of patient stillness. Behind you, the deeper vaults stretch away into darkness. Ahead, the corridor widens into one last chamber. A small fire burns low within an iron basin at the centre of the room. Its embers glow more than they flame, casting a warm amber light that flickers across the curved ceiling. The chamber feels calm, almost peaceful. Two figures sit nearby on wooden stools. They speak quietly while warming their hands above the coals. Their conversation drifts softly through the air but fades before you can catch more than a few words. The tone is relaxed, the sort of quiet talk that comes when a long day finally reaches its end. You pause near the doorway and let the warmth settle around you. The underground city has slowly changed throughout the night. Earlier you passed rooms full of work, laughter, music and conversation. Now most of the vaults lie quiet. Lanterns burn low. Fires glow gently as people drift into sleep. This hidden world beneath the streets has its own rhythm. During the 19th century, the Old Town of Edinburgh held thousands of residents living within its tall stone buildings and narrow closes. Reports written by reformers who visited the district often describe the astonishing density of people living within a relatively small space. In places where housing was scarce forgotten, vaults sometimes became homes, workshops and storage rooms. Yet the underground city was never entirely separate from the world above. Goods travelled through these passages. Workers moved between the vaults and the markets. Families adapted the spaces as best they could to create shelter. You walk slowly across the chamber. Near the fire, a kettle sits cooling on the edge of the iron basin. The faint scent of tea lingers in the air. The two residents glance up and nod politely as you pass. Their faces appear calm in the gentle glow of the coals. Beyond the chamber, another stairway rises toward the surface. You approach it slowly. The steps feel familiar now, like the many stairways you have climbed and ascended during your journey through the vaults. The lantern light flickers along the walls as you begin to climb. Halfway up, the air begins to change. It feels lighter, cooler. A soft grey light filters down from above, growing stronger with each step you take. You reach the top and step out into the narrow close. Morning has arrived. The sky above Edinburgh glows with the pale colours of dawn. Clouds drift slowly over the rooftops, and the stones of the close shine faintly from the rain that fell during the night. The city is beginning to wake. A baker pushes open the door of his shop farther down the street. Somewhere a cart rattles along the cobbles, carrying crates toward the market. A few early pedestrians move through the quiet morning air. You stand there for a moment, letting the lantern fade in the growing daylight. Beneath your feet, the underground vaults remain hidden. Most people walking these streets will never think about the chambers below. The arches and corridors lie quietly beneath the stone, holding the memories of countless lives that once moved through them. Some sections of the underground network were eventually sealed as the city modernised. New sanitation systems, building regulations and expanding neighbourhoods slowly changed how Edinburgh used its older spaces. Even so, parts of the buried city survived. Archaeologists and historians still explore the remaining vaults today, piecing together how these shadowed rooms once formed part of everyday life. You take a slow breath of the cool morning air. The sounds of the waking city drift gently around you. Carriage wheels, distant voices, the steady rhythm of footsteps beginning another day. And now, as the story draws quietly to a close, the pace of your walk slows. The energy of the night fades into the calm softness of morning. The lantern that guided you through the vaults is no longer needed. You can almost picture the underground chambers settling back into their quiet darkness beneath the streets. The fires cooling, the lanterns dimming, the corridors resting after the long night. The city above continues its life without ever fully noticing the hidden world beneath its feet. And as you stand here in the gentle light of dawn, the memory of those quiet vaults begins to drift into the distance, like the final notes of a fading song. The streets grow brighter, the air grows warmer. Your footsteps become slower and softer as the story gently fades away. Soon the underground city will feel like a dream you walked through during the night. A quiet place beneath stone arches. A hidden layer of history resting beneath the waking streets of Edinburgh. And now it is time to let the morning arrive. Sweet dreams.